Good evening. My name is Bill Martin. I'm the Senior Fellow for Religion and Public Policy here at the Baker Institute, and I'm happy to welcome you to this event. And on behalf of Ambassador Derigian, who's with us tonight, and also the fellows and scholars of the Institute. I want to welcome you to a stimulating evening. I'm particularly happy to have several members of the Houston Diplomatic Corps with us this evening, and I also want to recognize Mr. Kemal Aksus, the director of the Turquoise Council of Americans and Eurasians, who has graciously provided for our speakers' travel and lodging. It's a pleasure for me to welcome Graham Fuller to the Baker Institute this evening. As you can see from the program, which I will not read for you, Mr. Fuller has had a long and fascinating career. I'm not allowed to talk about the years we worked together in the CIA, since the Institute has a policy against just making stuff up with no basis in fact. But I have been aware of his work for some time and read a good bit of it and wanted to meet him and have him speak here. Graham Fuller is a major analyst of the Middle East, Central, Western Asia, and his books, the books that he has written or are co-authored, include The Future of Political Islam, The Center of the Universe, The Geopolitics of Iran, and A Sense of Siege, The Geopolitics of Islam and the West. In such works as these, he has often sharply criticized U.S. policy and has called on the West, which he regards as overly dependent on military might, to work with other powers to find ways to support the mostly peaceful, moderate, and pro-democracy Islamist movements already in operation. He also notes that North Americans desperately need access to broader media coverage of global events. He has said that Americans live in an isolated and self-censoring society that cuts us off from reality, a deadly luxury for a superpower. Graham Fuller has paid special attention to Turkey in such books as The New Turkish Republic, Turkey as a Pivotal State in the Muslim World, Turkey's New Geopolitics from the Balkans to Western China, and Turkey's Kurdish Question. If you have an interest in Turkey, which I recommend to you, but if you don't have much knowledge of it, Mr. Fuller's work will provide you with a rich learning experience. Well, actually, if you have a good bit of knowledge of it, you'll find it very useful. While on the subject of Turkey, let me remind you that tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock here at the Baker Institute, His Excellency Namık Tan, the Republic of Turkey's ambassador to the U.S., will speak on the subject, Turkey and American relations and Turkish foreign policy. There's still a space available for this, so I'd recommend that if you want to attend, that you RSVP and join us again tomorrow evening. But back to Graham Fuller. Mr. Fuller's topic this evening is A World Without Islam, which is also the title of his latest book. I can't claim to have quite finished it yet, but I am fascinated by the thesis, and I will finish it quite soon. As your program indicates, the Brazos Bookstore, Houston's most important independent book dealer, has books available for you outside for you to purchase this evening out after the program. And Mr. Fuller will be happy to autograph them for you. And as an added pleasure, while you wait in line, our friends at the Turquoise Council have graciously provided baklava. So, so you have several things to look forward to. Mr. Fuller will speak and then answer questions afterwards. And now I'm going to do something that I really don't like to do, and that is stop talking. So will you welcome Graham Fuller? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you to Rice University and to the Baker Center for inviting me to come here tonight. It's a great privilege. I know the Baker Center is a very distinguished institution among many in the United States in foreign policy area. I've read lots of their things, but have never actually had the chance to visit here, so it's a delight. the book that I wrote and that was published a little while back, as you know, is A World Without Islam. Many people have even asked me about the title of this and said, what do we make of this? Are you saying, what a wonderful world it would be if it was without Islam? Aren't you afraid that this is the way many people will interpret it? That what a great place it would be without Islam. Indeed, any of you who either know my previous writings or have looked at the book or read about the book know that indeed is not my intent. But my intent is a rather specific and narrow one. I've written lots of other books, and some of them when I was at Rand Corporation were slightly more academic. I'm not really an academic. I come out of an intelligence as a career as an intelligence officer. But I did learn that you've got to have a good title for a book. And indeed, I wrote an article a couple of years before the book came out called, with the same title, A World Without Islam, that was published in Foreign Policy magazine. And it was that article that interested a publisher to ask me to write a book along the subject. So the title does grab attention, and these days you have to grab attention if anybody is going to read you. And the title is deliberately, therefore, provocative. I might call it guerrilla journalism, if you will. Now, it's important for you also to know that I'm not, well, let me get right to the heart of it. The basic thesis of the book is, if there was never any Islam, if there was never a Prophet Muhammad, that the relationship between the West and the Middle East today would probably not be all that different. Please note, I'm not saying that the world would be the same or that the Middle East would be entirely the same, but I'm saying the relationship between the Middle East and the West, and particularly the United States, might be remarkably similar to what it is today. Now, this, on the face of it, sounds outrageous. I mean, we've been socialized in this country in particular for a decade at the least, maybe 2 decades, but certainly since 9/11, to believing, to tracing everything back to the problem of Islam. Furthermore, our Arabic vocabulary, if we've studied no Arabic, our Arabic vocabulary has probably grown by tenfold by learning the words of fatwa and mujahid and jihad and mujahideen and madrasa and takfir, and I can't even think of them all, but we've learned a lot of these terms. So it would suggest that Islam really is sort of the center of all of this, the source of it, and tons of books have come out talking about what is the problem with Islam, what is the problem with the Middle East, what is the problem with Saudi Arabia, in examining the nature of the Islamic challenge to the United States and to the West. So to suggest that perhaps if we took that factor out, that everything else might be the same, is seemingly rather outrageous. Now, I won't set forth everything that the book talks about. You can buy and read the book yourself, I hope. But let me just run through very quickly the gist of the argument. I argue. And just let me step back one more step. A couple of years back, 5-6 years ago, I published a book called The Future of Political Islam. And while I was doing research on this, and I traveled widely across the Middle East, and I mean the Muslim world as a whole, from Indonesia all the way west, and talked to lots of Islamists all over the place. And I was quite fascinated. The more I talked to them, the more I found that we spent all our time talking about local politics, economics, international politics, American politics, the nature of the West, Western history and all of this. And we talked about Islam hardly at all. And these movements usually don't talk about religion or Islam to that extent. They're focused on issues of domestic politics, domestic injustice, lack of democracy, lack of equality, lack of jobs, lack of education, all sorts of problems. And there are some very real problems in that part of the world. But focusing on religion, even in the Islamist movements themselves, was not that widespread. So this idea sort of percolated in my mind over time, and that's how I finally, one day it came to me as an interesting intellectual exercise. What would happen if you took Islam out of the equation? So the book goes back a fair way in history. It's not a history book, but I do go back finding. It's interesting to see that there were conflicts between East and West long before there was even Christianity. Those of you who've read something of your history know about the Persian Empire and the Greek Athens, and fighting across Anatolia even before the birth of Christianity. After Christianity, amazingly enough, there were the two empires, some of you may recall from history, the Western church, Christian church based in Rome, and the Eastern church based in Constantinople, today's Istanbul. The relationship between these two churches was not good and proceeded to get worse and worse and worse over time. So there was already anti-Western feeling in the Greek Orthodox part of the world. And there was fighting over who would have the right to convert pagans or barbarians, if you will, in the Balkans or in Slavs or Russians or other parts of the world. There was considerable, or even among Germans, who would get there first to convert them to their side. There was debate over how much authority the Pope would have, if any authority, in the Eastern Orthodox world. There were quarrels about theology. But it's interesting, we wonder about how serious these quarrels over theology really were, because they seem quite weird and abstruse. And to me, the most shocking case of all, if you look at the ultimate split between the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church and the Western Roman Church, Christian Church, in the 11th century, you find the issue was something called the filioque clause. Already it sounds exotic. The basic argument in a nutshell was this. One side said the Holy Spirit, and that is not exactly a precise term, although widely used in Christianity. Whatever it means, the Holy Spirit is descended from God the Father. And the other side said, no, the Holy Spirit is descended from God the Father and God the Son. That's the filioque in Latin, and the Son. Over this incredibly abstruse and complex difference, if it means anything, these two mighty empires burst apart, denounced each other, excommunicated each other, and it was takfir, we would call it today in Islam, over this issue. Now, when you see something like this, you have to know that something else is going on here besides an argument over the nature of the Holy Ghost. And indeed there was. This had to do with politics and economics and power and turf and territory and everything else. And one of the primary arguments of the book is that the explanation of trouble and conflict between the Middle East and the West, or America today, has to do with politics and geography and economics and geopolitics and imperialism and colonialism and Western intervention, constant intervention into the Muslim world, and indeed most of the whole world in the colonial period. So the desire of the West to monopolize or control and dominate oil and energy resources in the Middle East, to impose Western leaders upon the Middle East, to redraw the borders of Middle Eastern countries according to how the West wanted to have it, especially dividing it up between French spheres of influence and British spheres of influence. Constant wars launched against the region. The list is very long, and you don't have to be a Muslim in that part of the world to begin to resent this a very great deal. And in fact, I would argue that if the most of the Middle East had not been Muslim, but had remained Christian as they were under the Greek Orthodox Church, if they had remained Christian, would they have welcomed Western imperialists coming in? Would they have welcomed seizure of their oil energy resources? Would they have welcomed the repartition of their borders and territory? Would they have welcomed the imposition of leaders who will be obedient to Western governments on top of them? Would they welcome constant invasion and warfare against them? I don't think it's hard to imagine that they would not welcome this. Even if they were Buddhist, they would not have welcomed any of these processes. So I don't, again, think it has that much to do with religion. Now, if this is... there are some quite fascinating cases in the book. I won't go into it at all in further detail, but some of you may recall Samuel Huntington's argument a number of years ago about the clash of civilizations, and he described the bloody borders of Islam, which is where Islam bordered against other civilizations. I have several chapters in the book that talk about Islam dealing in Russia, in China, and in India, which presenting examples of how actually Islam and other religions have had interesting coexistence through that long period of time, and often creative interaction, sometimes conflict, but not by no means the rule. So I think if you read the book is really meant to shake up traditional thinking about the nature of the conflict between East and West. There are many things that you could pick holes in. It is a what-if argument. Obviously, there was an Islam, and it did interact with the West. And I could even write a rebuttal to the book myself if I wanted to. But the fact still remains that you can explain huge amounts of what is going on today by even taking out this Islamic factor. Okay, well, what about religion? Is religion meaningless? Does it have no meaning? I don't want you to think that, first of all, that I'm against religion or I'm suggesting that religion only relates to power. But religion is a very great force in our lives. Even if we're not necessarily believers. Religion tells us about our goals, our purpose in life, the purpose of life, explains life and death and afterlife, it explains sexuality, all kinds of issues. It's a very powerful force. And therefore, no state is willing to leave well enough alone. Religion is too important to be left to clerics. So as a result, invariably, you find states here, there, and elsewhere attempting to control as much as possible religion so that they can use it for their own benefit and not allow it to be used against the state. But sometimes it is used against the state, and those struggles are still going on by regimes everywhere to try to control religion as much as possible. So, I think I would like to talk a little bit now about the role that religion or ideologies do play in conflicts in the past. My basic argument is no state likes to boldly and nakedly say, we want your resources, we want your turf, we hate your leader, we're going to overthrow him, although sometimes that does happen. But basically, we try to find higher justification for this. And over the years, we see the emergence of ideologies. Wars beginning on the basis of the war to end all wars, a war to spread democracy, a war to invasions to spread human rights, wars on behalf of the proletariat international in the case of the Soviet Union, war on behalf of the Aryan master race in the case of Hitler. There are always very high justifications given. And religion, I would argue, is essentially the banner, the flag by which warfare and conflict takes place. So if you take away that banner, some other banner would surely emerge. If you look, for example, it's very interesting just at the, well, let me say this. A lot of people come listen to this talk and say, you know, in the end, isn't religion itself, it's not just Islam, isn't religion itself the problem? Isn't religion what causes us to come into conflict because I believe deeply in my religion and you believe in yours, and hence it's a source of conflict? Well, maybe, but if we look at the history of the 20th century, and I would argue that the 20th century is probably the most hideous, ugly century in the history of the human race. More people were killed by war in the 20th century than ever in history, partly because killing machines were improved, but it was an exceptionally bloody century. How many of these terrible wars and conflicts had to do with religion? Franco, I don't think so, rather fascist. Mussolini, fascist. Hitler, fascist, Nazi. Stalin, communist, atheist. Then communism spreading to China under Mao Zedong. 20 million, 30 million people being killed in the process. Communist regime. Pol Pot killing millions of people in his country in Cambodia. Outspoken atheist. See, we're really very hard put to find a single case where religion has been the source of massive killing. The best possible case we can come up with, perhaps, is the partition of India in 1947, where by the British, a colonial power, partitioned India from Pakistan, and there were a fair number of people killed in that conflict, probably maybe upwards of 1 million. But this is nothing compared to nearly 100 million people in various other conflicts throughout that century. So, yes, Islam, a religion rather, in general, can produce hostility, but I think it's absurd to suggest that religion itself is the source of this conflict. I think we all know human nature well enough to know that we will find reasons and grounds for attacking and fighting neighbors over one or another issue without religion or without the ideology to go with it. Okay, so the conclusion of my book, there are many other chapters in there that I think you would find interesting, a discussion of the Crusades, for example. We think of the Crusades as the absolutely essential, quintessential struggle between one religion and another, the Christianity and communism. Christianity and Islam. But I won't go into it, but when you read the chapter on the Crusades, it's quite astonishing to me. Many of you may know this if you read about the Crusades, but it really had a lot to do about European power, European struggles, economics, sociology, and everything else, and not much about really religion at all. After all, the Muslims took over Jerusalem in the 7th century, and it took Western Christianity 500 years to decide to do something about it. So why 500 years later did it suddenly become a huge campaign to do something? Other things were going on in this case. Now, let me just quickly say a few words about my conclusions, which may be more sharper, perhaps, than the earlier part of the book. Why does this matter, this book? Maybe it's a clever playing around with history to suggest that, you could have done without Islam. But that's not my intent. My intent, I think, is to suggest that whether Islam is the key source of conflict or not matters a great deal. A great deal. Because if we say that Islam is the problem, then therefore I'm saying it's them, it's their problem, they have problems, and indeed the Muslim world or most of the rest of the world does have problems, we have problems, but it's their problem, it's Islam, they've got to shape up, they've got to change, and furthermore it suggests a religious cultural problem that can't be overcome in anything less than maybe 100 years, and maybe some of you have seen mention of 100 years war even on the part of a few figures in Washington, or at least at least people talking about a struggle for generations going on. But it's always them. It's always them. If, on the other hand, we say, no, the problem is not essentially about Islam or religion, but the problem has to do with a long history of Western intervention, imperialism, British and French and others controlling most of the colonial world, the long anti-colonial struggle, the exploitation of the economies of colonial countries, as I said, the division of the borders, all of these things, redrawing of the borders, intervention right down now to the global war on terrorism. If we say that is the problem, then it makes it more of a two-way street. It makes it complicated. It means we've got to sit down and analyze what the grievances are there, how can we avoid them, where does their responsibility fit in, and where does our responsibility fit in, and it becomes a serious issue of longer negotiation, but not some impossible grand religious conflict about which most of us could do nothing. So that's why I think this book matters, to overcome this issue. Now, you notice that I've talked a lot about what the West, both Europe and the United States later, has done to the Middle East. I'm not suggesting that the West is somehow uniquely evil, and the Middle East is poor, victimized, and this kind of thing. What is very clear, however, is that starting sometime around the 16th, 17th century, the West greatly surpassed the power of the Muslim world. So the West has had the power to extend itself around the world, develop colonies, control them, have the economic and military resources to control most of the world for a very long time. That's the reason this happened, not because the West was particularly more evil. One could imagine, if the shoe had been on the other foot, that if the Muslim world had been growing in power and the West had been weakening, possibly it might have happened the other way around. But it didn't. This is the way it happened. So I am suggesting strongly that we need to sit down and analyze what the real problems are and get away from this simplistic argument that Islam is the problem. My one bumper sticker in the book is that history did not begin with 9/11. We're in bad trouble if we think that history began with 9/11, because this suggests that nothing happened before 9/11 that could possibly have had any impact on it. I think somehow we were often socialized here in this country to believe that, here we were just trying to run the world, standing around innocently trying to run the world, keep things on an even course, when suddenly we were attacked out of the blue by a bunch of fanatic radicals. We were attacked by a bunch of fanatic radicals, and it was an outrageous attack, but that was not the beginning of history. It goes way back, and to simply decide who has done what to whom first is a long, long task. I'm suggesting that we accept the idea that blame falls in various directions, and then maybe we can begin to get on with it. Now, the last point I think I'd like to make, and then let's throw it open to discussion. What can we do about this? The first recommendation in my book is rather simple. Some might say simple-minded, perhaps, and that is that we have got to withdraw American troops out of the Muslim world as a whole. We have a huge footprint. We have at least two big wars going on. One is Iraq, the other is Afghanistan, but several smaller wars now and beginning to creep into Pakistan, that we are getting dangerously close to possible conflict with Iran, possible war with Iran, and the Palestinian issue in which we are indirectly linked. And Somalia and Yemen are on very dangerous turf. So there's a lot of conflict going on. I believe that the boots on the ground, the American footprint on the ground, and this is not my term, by the way, this is a Pentagon term, boots on the ground, footprints on the ground. It's a very telling term. I mean, it's suggestive of Godzilla or something. Need to come out, and as fast as possible. Now, I feel often vulnerable in presenting this case because it seems to be either too simple, oversimplified. I felt much gratified today when I attended a meeting at which Robert Pape from the University of Chicago was speaking this morning. I've met him before, and he's produced several books. Quite a remarkable man. He has a very persuasive lecture, and I urge you to Google it and take a look at it. He claims that he can statistically, and does statistically demonstrate that it is almost overwhelming evidence that the reason why we have suicide terrorism, and that's what he examines. His book is called I don't remember the title, but it's about suicide terrorism. He claims that in almost every case, if you look at the spikes of why things have happened, it's traceable to U.S. military presence, foreign occupation, in case after case after case after case. And he arrives, as a scientist, using statistical data, at the same conclusion that I reached, not being a scholar and a statistician or a political scientist, but having worked and lived and talked with Islamists for much of my life, arrives at virtually the same conclusion, that the first and most urgent task is to remove foreign occupation from Muslim soil before anything can begin to calm down. Problems remain, but that is the biggest source of anger, of radicalization, and recruits for more radical organizations, including bin Laden himself. Secondly, it's a less urgent argument, but I am concerned that we are spending literally now trillions of dollars, $1 or $2 trillion, which begins to be a fair amount of money, on prosecuting at least these two wars. Think if only a fraction of that money was being spent on building schools and hospitals and clinics and infrastructure in Afghanistan, in Iraq, any other number of places across the Muslim world. A fraction of that money, what could be done with it? Not to mention the way it is bleeding the American economy dry. So I think there are some very practical reasons. This is not some nice airy-fairy idealistic argument of saying, wouldn't it be nice if we had money for peace and not for war? There's some very hard-headed grounds on which to believe to make a case for exactly this proposition. So let me just say one other thing, which is I've presented a fairly dark picture of what is happening. I think the situation, frankly, is getting worse in the Middle East and the Muslim world. I think we are digging a hole ever deeper. I would have to say I think we are, frankly, losing these wars, and I'm not alone. There are analysts within the bowels of government writing secret reports that leak out into the press, saying much the same thing, but it is not official policy. We are losing these wars, and we're, in my view, worsening and deepening the conflict. The one really bright star on this entire horizon I see today is Turkey, where a country, a Muslim country, has, after some 3 or 4 decades of political development and struggle, has now emerged as a strong democracy, an incredibly powerful economy, now one of the true growing economies of the world. That is the greatest military power in the Muslim world and in the Middle East, except for Israel. That is beginning to have a dynamic new foreign policy of trying to deal with its neighbors on the basis of reconciliation and negotiation. After years of terrible relations with all its neighbors, it's turned that around with virtual stroke of a pen and is now working to try to overcome problems between the U.S. and Syria, Turkey. Well, they've worked with Turkey and Syria, with the U.S. and Iran, along with Brazil on nuclear issues, which is far from over, to try to deal between Israel and Hamas and other neighbors, to expand its influence and diplomacy across the region, avoiding war and trying to look towards, as I say, negotiation. So this is a very bright image. And in a similar vein, the Gülen movement, which many of you have heard of undoubtedly, is the biggest social movement based on religious values in Turkey today, with huge infrastructure, educational infrastructure, devoting lots of attention to education, communications, publications, and schools now in perhaps over 100 countries of the world, including in the United States, and has many centers, including here in Texas, and indeed many of the lectures that I've been giving here have been part of the cooperation with the various Gülen-affiliated organizations. So I urge you to take note of what can happen when religious organizations in the Middle East based on Islam have a chance to develop, and not just for Turkey, but to begin to draw the attention of other Muslim countries that desperately need rethinking about their own Islamic politics. Because make no mistake, Islam is going to be deeply part of any political system and political order in the region. But what kind of a system? And the Gülen schools, the Gülen model, the Gülen idea of tolerance and reconciliation and outreach and dialogue and negotiation is really critical to overcoming many of these barriers. So that is the one really good news I see across the entire region, and I hope there's good reason to believe that this model is being watched carefully by other countries in the region who themselves are despairing of ever getting anywhere about how to get out from under their own dictatorships or develop more moderate Islamist movements or the like. Turkey, in this sense, really is quite a remarkable model. So thank you very much, and I look forward to some tough questions, rebuttals. That's the way I learn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham. Before we start the questions, I'd just like to mention a couple of things to you. Some of you were perhaps present here in December when we had a program, had a speaker, a young professor who spoke about the Gülen movement and based on his dissertation. And that is available on our website. If you go to Religion and Public Policy, you will see archives and website presentations, and this is by Professor Joshua Hendricks. Also, among publications there, I have a couple of one article that was in Texas Monthly last August called Head of the Class, which is about the Harmony Science Schools here in Texas. And there's along with it is called Lessons Learned, which actually should be read after Head of the Class, even though they're flipped on their website, because it's the Q&A in some places where I was able to expand on that a bit. So I had another point, and perhaps I will remember what it is before I finish this sentence, but apparently not. But we do want to offer you the opportunity to ask Mr. Fuller questions, and we like to follow here at the Baker Institute. We use the Jeopardy model. Would you put that in the form of a question, please? Oh, I do know what the other point I wanted to make was. My synapses used to fire, and now they just lob. But little brown light goes across. But in any case, among our guests tonight is Professor Helen Rose Ebaugh from the University of Houston, who has written a book about the Gülen movement, and she's been traveling in Europe and signing books. And was it last week or week before last? Week before last, she was in Istanbul, and you've signed a lot of books, and I've signed a few. She had 20,000 people show up to line up to buy a book, which is, Sarah Palin, eat your heart out. Well, I understand. So now, if you have questions for Mr. Fuller, please. Yes, sir.
With respect to boots on the ground, do you believe that the American boots will be out of Iraq at the end of 2011, and whether that will be a positive development? And were there ever Or are there still American boots on the ground as a part of Turkey's being part of NATO?
Very good questions. First of all, yes, and in NATO, it's a good point as to what exactly does boots on the ground mean. I think it's a pretty minimal presence in terms of Turkish awareness. You don't have all kinds of soldiers wandering around in the streets. It's more of a facility than a base for military operations by far. But I don't have total knowledge, and perhaps some others here might have it. But I think it's very much avoided. I mean, it's still politically sensitive. Turks are very clear. They say you will not use this air base against Iran, or you will not use it for this, that, or the other thing. So the framework is quite clear. Whereas in Iraq, we have absolute sovereignty to do what we want. In effect, that may be quickly vanishing. But the main problem is I can't answer your question about whether we will still have a presence or not, because I think this is being heavily debated within Washington. And the reasons, as you know, for our going into the war there were multiple, depending on who you talk to. Some people saw this as a quick and dirty effort to get rid of Saddam Hussein, which probably is a reasonably praiseworthy goal, but others saw this as a huge project to completely redo the country. We ended up destroying the country's infrastructure incredibly in the process. But and there are those who still, I mean, there was talk that Iraq would turn into a bastion of pro-Americanism in the region, that they would immediately open full diplomatic relations with Israel, that they would sell tons of oil to Israel, and that it would be a base for American projection of power around the rest of the Middle East and against Iran and elsewhere. Frankly, I don't think a single one of those, and that America would have the advantage in oil in Iraq thereafter. I don't think a single one of those goals has been realized or will be realized. So really at this point what we're talking about is how to get out with the least damage to ourselves and with trying to get a minimal kind of degree of stability, but not with the people we'd really like to have in government, ideally. We still have one of the biggest embassy in the world in Iraq, although the embassy in Afghanistan is soon going to surpass and be even bigger. But what, the number of troops that are left over is still under discussion. Some in Washington would like to have a lot and be the backdrop to what Iraqis do. Others say, forget about it, it's not going to happen. And I tend pretty strongly to fall into that camp. I think Iraq is really feeling its sovereignty now and will not want that presence, which seems to cast doubt on Iraqi sovereignty. Every Iraqi leader feels quite passionately about that.
In the back there, and then you're next.
What role does the differential treatment of women play in this drama, if any?
I'm not quite sure what your question is getting at. In terms of our geopolitical decisions, I don't think the role of women and discrimination against women in many cases, especially in Afghanistan, I don't think this is a truly serious geopolitical consideration. I think if it was women's situation were good, actually in Iraq it was very good. Saddam had quite an excellent record on women's roles in the state, to the extent that anybody had a political voice in the country. Women did very well indeed. It was a highly secular government. No, I couldn't possibly say it about Afghanistan. You're absolutely right. But I don't think we would have gone to war in Afghanistan over that issue, and I don't think we are going to leave. I don't think that the resolution of that issue is going to affect when and how we leave. I'm not saying it isn't important. It does matter. I think it matters among many human rights issues all over the globe in which many outrages are taking place. I don't think we can intervene and go to war and destroy, essentially what ends up destroying countries in the name of protecting women's rights either. So yes, it's a laudable goal. I'd love to see better education for women, but I don't think that, I frankly just don't think it's on the horizon in terms of the ultimate settlement of what Washington is going to think about, or in any other country. Human rights simply is not the driving factor.
Growing up in the Middle East, I've noticed that Muslim countries, there's horrible treatment of non-Muslims in virtually every Muslim country, even in Turkey, which is the supposedly, Muslim success story. And even where you have large numbers of Muslims living side by side with non-Muslims, where they're minorities, such as in Kashmir, or in Xinjiang in Western China, or in Thailand, you see conflict there. In the beginning of the lecture, you were heavily weighted towards what effect colonialism and Western control over Muslim countries had. To what extent, are Muslims responsible for their own problems, and to what extent have the clash of civilizations, quote unquote, between the West and the Muslim world, has to what extent has that, been caused by these Muslim, these things in the Muslim world, the treatment of Copts or the treatment of Armenians in Iran, or that kind of thing. Can you comment on that?
Sure. First of all, I think it is one of the sad rules of life in general that when conflict starts, when any kind of confrontation or tensions rise, that communities begin to separate out and begin to close in among themselves. I think the history, any of you who know your history of the Middle East, for example, vis-a-vis Jews, will know that the Jews have probably fared better living in the Middle East and the Muslim world than anywhere else in the entire world, and certainly more than Western Europe, where there's a long, long history of discrimination against Jews that did not exist under Muslim rule. I would argue, furthermore, that's still largely the case. There is a large Jewish community in Turkey, among other things. They are staying there. The Turks who have immigrated, Jewish Turks who have immigrated to Israel, are very pro-Turkish. So I think in that area, furthermore, there's a very large Jewish community in Iran. There are several, I don't know how many members, number anyway, of Jewish representatives within the parliament, and Jews are not preparing to leave Iran, who feel very much part of that country. If you ask me, is it perfect? Certainly not. Copts, yes, that tension has grown to the extent that Islamist movements have developed. But the more you get tensions within the country, and Christians, Western Christians identifying with Christians living in the area or supporting them, the more this tends to take on geopolitical struggle.
Would you argue that Christians in these countries under Islamic rule have always been second-class citizens? They've always been dhimmis, Jews. I mean, they were afforded a level of tolerance, but they were always third-class citizens. They could not try a Muslim in court. They could not take a case against a Muslim. They, laws of apostasy, these have been constants of Islamic history throughout, since Muhammad's armies conquered.
Laws of apostasy really don't have anything to do with Christians. And what I would certainly agree that throughout most of history, there have been questions of where did you rate and whether you were a first-class or second-class citizen. Certainly in all of Western Europe, this has been a long tradition, especially for the position of Jews in Europe, including the need for special clothing in many different parts of the country. I will readily admit that there have been periods of discrimination, but there have been periods of incredible coexistence. But the more the pressures have risen in countries in the Middle East today, the greater these interreligious tensions have grown. I believe that if we were able, Turkey has been able to increasingly better deal with these situations once you have a democratic order. When you have a country like Egypt, which is coming apart in many ways, well, not coming apart, that's far too strong a word, but be reaching an explosive situation over internal politics and anti-regime activity, and then Islamists who are the primary opposition movements against the regime in power. Inevitably, this reflects on communal attitudes. These community struggles go way, way back in history, but they have never been as bad as, I would argue, as they are today, when the whole region is simply up in flames, and not the least due to proximity of war across the region. But yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. If we want to talk about Christians were in a sense, second-class citizens under Islamic law, but also Christians were excused, for example, from the obligation to serve in Muslim military, which they were happy not to have to do. And they had to pay a poll tax in return for that. But if you look at the Ottoman Empire, for example, Christians made up the majority of the special forces of the country. They came out of Christian communities. There were Jewish and Christian ministers within the state. There still are. Not in Turkey today, but in other countries, in Muslim Spain and other things. So I think to single out this area, especially as opposed to Western Europe, I think you're on fairly thin ice at a time when discrimination, ethnic, religious, has always been the normal part of community distinctions.
Yes.
You mentioned Egypt. What are your reflections on what's going on in Egypt and Tunisia in terms of outcomes and importance?
Yeah, several people have asked me that on this trip. Do I think this is going to spread beyond Tunisia? First of all, let me say I'm delighted that there has been a revolution in Tunisia. I think it has been, in the last decade, a fairly nasty regime, although we never read about it in the Western press because he was a friend and keeping the lid on for us. So I'm pleased that he's gone because it was a pretty rough regime. And indeed, when I visited there some 10 years ago doing research, I was able to talk to a lot of people. I was told very clearly that when I tried to go back a few years thereafter, that nobody would even talk to me because they were afraid to be seen talking to Western researchers. Anyway, will it spread? God knows whether it will spread. It's hard to say. And furthermore, I have been burnt in the past, at least to myself, in saying, now things are going to change. Now it's opening up. Now the floodgates will open. Now we can see real change coming about. I've been disappointed over and over and over and over again. So having been burned 5-6 times, I'm a little reluctant to say, yes, this is the moment, it's going to happen. But yes, maybe there will be. I don't know. Nobody knows what that fine tipping point will be. But God knows it's way overdue. This matters in all sorts of ways because part of the rage of the region, yes, there's anger against the United States, but there's also rage at their own situation there, that Muslims in so many countries have very little control over their destinies. They're controlled by their own authoritarian rulers, tortured, jailed, executed, and the foreign policy, let's say if you were an Iraqi under Saddam, Saddam, sends the first son off to war to die in Kuwait, kills the father, arrests and executes the father for speaking up against the wars, and then you have American B-52s coming in and bombing the country, and another member of the family is killed as collateral damage. So what sense of empowerment, self-empowerment would you have in that case, which I see leads to both a sense of fatalism, there's nothing we can do, it's all out of our control, it's the West, it's our rulers and everything else. This is not a healthy state of affairs, especially we Americans who are used to taking charge and determining our own destiny. These people cannot in case after case after case. So they're open to blandishments from Islamist movements who do want to bring change and who do want to remove the regimes and who do want some social justice and often, or sometimes anyway, happen to put together regimes that sort of work. In the case of Turkey, it was more than sort of work. The present ruling government, which came out of Islamic roots, has happened to have done very well. I wouldn't have guessed it would have done very well, but I said maybe it would do okay, but it's been very well. So I really think it's essential, even for our interests, that in the long run we see democracies spread in the area, but with the proviso. Right now, there's a lot of anger. There's widespread anger against the United States, widespread anger on all sorts of issues, including the global war on terrorism and the wars, and 100%, support for Israel and the Arab-Israeli problem, and support for local regimes. I think that would begin to go away if Muslims felt they had a control over their own destinies. But yeah, Islamists will come to power in many, many of these places in the first elections. But it isn't that Muslims are sitting around craving, just bring Islam, and everything will be fine. No, they want people to deliver. And even if Islamists come to power, I would argue they will have a window of a year, at best two, to deliver the goods. I wouldn't say deliver the bacon. To deliver the goods, and if they don't, then people are going to go elsewhere. They're not going to waste time with Islamists who are going to talk all about God and jihad and everything else. They want the electricity, they want the education, they want the jobs, they want the income, they want better health service, they want more independence and sovereignty. So, but we've got to be prepared to ride with people in office, at least for a while, that we may not fully like. Sadly, our commitment to democracy in the region has been really sketchy. We support democracy as a weapon against our enemies, like Saddam or Iran, but never as a gift to friends, because if we have loyal authoritarian monarchs or despots and they're pro-American, that's fine. So we don't have any credibility in supporting democracy in the region, sadly, because I believe as Americans we have it, but our government and our policies do not.
There was one other hand that was up there before. Do you still want to ask your question?
Well, it's that my question was that you seem to make a pretty hard partition between so-called Islamists and those political leaders who want social justice, who are looking out for good public policy and such as that. Would you consider that organizations such as the Ikhwan Muslim Brotherhood or the Jamaat Islami, would they fall under your category of Islamists who are just concerned with liturgy and theology, or actually those who want to implement public policy that is consistent with Islam?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm very glad you answered it. In my book, The Future of Political Islam, I offer a definition of Islamist or political Islam. Both I use interchangeably. Islamist, Islamism, political Islam. My definition is very broad. I say any Muslim who believes that the Quran and the life experience and sayings of the Prophet have important things to say for Islamic governance and society, and try to implement this in some way, is an Islamist. Now, is Osama bin Laden an Islamist? Yes. I think he has a warped, twisted, and violent utopian sense of what this is all about. But that's at the far extreme. Most of these Islamist movements are more centrist, some are conservative, some are more radical but nonviolent, some are more moderate, some less so. Most by now favor democracy because they feel that they can do pretty well in a democratic order. A few still resist that. But it's a broad spectrum, and you talked about the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, or other parties. They would fall somewhere along that perspective. I would put the present ruling party in Turkey today, the Justice and Development Party, the AKP as it's known, at the far I don't want to say left or right, but at the far moderate, extreme moderate side, and they indeed don't even call themselves the Islamist party. They would admit that they had come out of Islamist roots. But the point is here that there is evolution among Islamist movements. They learn something over time. Hopefully we all do. So they've seen failures. They've seen big mistakes made in other regimes that they begin to want to avoid. Interesting case in point, I was talking to an Islamist in Turkey, 5-6 years ago. I talked to a lot of these people. But he was telling me, he said, for a while we believed that if we could come to power that we should impose Muslim morality in terms of headdress or crime or any number of things. But he said after watching other states try this, because by the way, it's never been tried. There's never been really an Islamic state in history. We all think there's been. The Quran says nothing about an Islamic state. There's nothing in there about how to run an Islamic state, what its principles should be other than justice and consultation. So they've learned a lot from some of this. And this guy, this Turk, told me, he said, you know, we finally reached the conclusion that the gates of hell should be open to anybody. In other words, it's not the state's business to close the gates of hell so nobody can go in. He even used the term in Turkish, the freedom to commit a sin. But we all would draw, freedom to commit a sin. We believe in that in the United States. Well, what kind of sin? We all would say, no, murder, you can't do that. You don't have that freedom. To steal, no, you don't have that freedom. To sexual relations with minors, no, we don't have that freedom. But we're getting selective here now. There are those who might say, well, if you're a loving relationship, then even if the child is young, then that's okay. Or there are all sorts of, different conditions. We might accept this or polygamy in certain cases. They're all arguable where we draw the line on morality and what is acceptable and what not. But what I'm trying to say is these movements are learning, changing their minds, getting more savvy about what will work and what will not work. And Turkey, again, is the ultimate case in point, where it has evolved over the last 30, 20, 10 years in different ways with the Gulen movement, which is non-political, apolitical, and the ruling party. They've learned a lot, and I think that's one reason or other why they're functioning. So I don't want to say Islamic. If you're interested in Islamist principles, Islamic ideals in government, I don't want to say, oh, that's the bad guys. If you're not an Islamist if you're a good guy. I want to say, no, you can become a good guy. You can have good governance, and you can learn some things and have some tolerance. But some of those parties have a long way to go, and the Taliban are one of them. But it is ongoing, evolving, changing situation. And the more independence they have to learn these things, the easier it's going to be on everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.